In the world of royalty, some secrets are worth killing for, others are worth dying for, but the most dangerous ones are those worth photographing. When 12-year-old Princess Isabella of Valdoria picked up her camera that foggy October morning, she had no idea that a single click would unravel a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and threatened to destroy everything her family had built over 3 centuries. The morning mist clung to the ancient stone walls of Ravencrest Palace like ghostly fingers, reluctant to release their grip as the sun struggled to pierce through the thick fog that had settled over the kingdom of Valdoria overnight. Princess Isabella Aurora Blackwood stood at her bedroom window on the 3rd floor of the palace's east wing, pressing her nose against the cold glass as she watched the world below slowly emerge from its gray shroud. At 12 years old, Isabella possessed the keen observational skills that often went unnoticed in children, but would prove invaluable in the days to come. Her dark hair fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and her emerald eyes held an intelligence that sometimes unnerved the palace staff. Unlike her older brother Prince Alexander, who was being groomed for the throne with endless lessons in statecraft and diplomacy, Isabella had been given more freedom to explore her interests, chief among them photography. The camera had been a gift from her uncle Marcus on her 11th birthday, a professional-grade device that he had taught her to use during his rare visits to the palace. Uncle Marcus, the king's younger brother, had always been different from the rest of the royal family. Where her father, King Edmund, was formal and measured in his speech, Marcus was warm and approachable. Where the Queen Mother, Victoria, insisted on strict protocol, Marcus encouraged Isabella to question everything around her. A good photographer, he had told her during one of their walks through the palace gardens, sees what others miss. They capture not just what is, but what might be hidden beneath the surface. Those words echoed in Isabella's mind as she adjusted the camera settings, preparing for another morning of wandering the palace grounds in search of interesting subjects. The fog created an almost ethereal atmosphere that she knew would make for compelling photographs, with the ancient oak trees appearing like sentinels emerging from a dream. Isabella dressed quickly in her riding clothes, dark pants, and a forest green sweater that would help her blend into the landscape. She had learned early that the best photographs came when people forgot she was there, when they behaved naturally instead of putting on the formal facades that seemed to automatically activate whenever they noticed her presence. The palace corridors were unusually quiet as she made her way toward the main staircase. Most of the staff wouldn't begin their duties for another hour, and her parents were likely still in their private chambers, preparing for what Isabella knew would be a busy day of meetings and official functions. Her brother Alexander was probably already in the library, studying ancient treaties or practicing his Latin with his tutor, Professor Whitmore. As Isabella descended the grand staircase, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet that ran down the center of the marble steps, she caught sight of Thomas Hartwell, one of the senior palace guards, standing near the main entrance. Thomas had been with the royal family for nearly 15 years, having started as a junior guard when Isabella was just a toddler. Over the years, he had become something of a favorite among the royal children, always ready with a kind word or a helping hand when they needed it. Thomas was a man of average height, but impressive build, his uniform always immaculate, and his bearing unmistakably military. His brown hair was beginning to show traces of silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held the alertness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. Unlike some of the other guards who maintained a strict professional distance, Thomas had a warmth about him that made the royal children feel safe and protected rather than simply monitored. "Good morning, Your Highness," Thomas said with a slight bow as Isabella approached. "You're up early today." "Good morning, Thomas. I wanted to take some photographs in the fog before it lifts," Isabella replied, holding up her camera. "The light is perfect right now." Thomas smiled, recognizing the enthusiasm in her voice. He had watched Isabella grow from a precocious little girl into a thoughtful young woman, and he admired her artistic interests. In a world where every aspect of royal life was scrutinized and planned, Isabella's photography seemed to offer her a small measure of freedom and self-expression. Just be careful near the East Gardens, Thomas advised. The groundskeepers mentioned that some of the paths might be slippery from the overnight moisture. Isabella nodded and thanked him before making her way through the main doors and out into the misty morning air. The fog was even thicker outside than had appeared from her window, creating an almost magical atmosphere that transformed the familiar palace grounds into something mysterious and otherworldly. She began her photographic journey in the formal gardens, where the geometric patterns of the hedges created interesting shapes when partially obscured by the mist. The ancient fountain at the center of the garden, with its carved dolphins and cherubs, seemed to emerge from the fog like something from a fairy tale. Isabella adjusted her camera settings to capture the ethereal quality of the scene, experimenting with different angles and exposures. As she worked her way through the gardens, Isabella became absorbed in her art, the way she always did when she had a camera in her hands. The world around her seemed to fade away except for what she saw through the viewfinder, and she found herself moving deeper into the palace grounds than she usually ventured during her morning photography sessions. The fog seemed to grow thicker as she approached the more remote areas of the estate, where ancient oak trees formed a natural boundary between the formal palace grounds and the wild forest beyond. These were areas that Isabella rarely visited, partly because they were considered less safe for a young princess to wander alone, and partly because there was simply less of interest to photograph in the dense woodland. But this morning, something drew her forward. Perhaps it was the way the fog swirled between the tree trunks, creating patterns that seemed almost alive, or maybe it was simply the photographer's instinct that Uncle Marcus had taught her to trust. Whatever the reason, Isabella found herself following a narrow path that wound between the massive oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead that seemed to trap the mist and create an even more mysterious atmosphere. It was then that she heard the voices. At first, Isabella thought she might be imagining things. The fog had a way of playing tricks with sound, making distant noises seem closer and clear sounds appear muffled and distorted. But as she stood perfectly still, barely breathing, she became certain that there were people talking somewhere ahead of her, their voices low and urgent. Isabella's first instinct was to turn around and head back toward the palace. She had been taught from an early age to respect privacy and avoid eavesdropping on adult conversations. But something about the tone of the voices made her hesitate. There was an intensity, almost a desperation, that seemed out of place in the peaceful morning setting. Moving as quietly as she could, Isabella crept forward along the path, her camera hanging around her neck, and her heart beginning to beat faster. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but the voices were becoming clearer with each step. The documents must be destroyed before the summit. A man's voice was saying, the words crisp and authoritative despite being spoken in a whisper. If they surface now, it will ruin everything we've worked for. Understand the risks, came a second voice, this one belonging to a woman. But we need to be absolutely certain that no copies exist. If even one document survives. Isabella froze as she recognized the woman's voice. It belonged to Lady Margaret Thornfield, one of her mother's closest advisors, and a woman who had been like an aunt to Isabella throughout her childhood. Lady Margaret was known for her sharp intelligence and unwavering loyalty to the crown, qualities that had made her one of the most trusted members of the royal inner circle. But there was something in her tone now that Isabella had never heard before, a coldness that sent a chill down the young princess's spine. The king must never know, Lady Margaret continued. Edmund is too honorable for his own good. If he discovered what we've done, he would insist on making it public, regardless of the consequences to the monarchy or the kingdom. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. They were talking about her father, and whatever they were discussing, it was something they were deliberately keeping from him. The realization that people she had trusted her entire life were engaged in some kind of deception sent waves of confusion and fear through her young mind. The summit begins in 3 days, the man's voice replied. By then, all evidence of the Meridian Accords must be eliminated. The other kingdoms can never learn what really happened during the negotiations 20 years ago. Isabella had never heard of the Meridian Accords, but something about the name sent a shiver of recognition through her. 20 years ago would have been around the time her father had first ascended to the throne, following the sudden death of her grandfather, King William. She had always been told that her grandfather had died of natural causes, a heart attack brought on by the stress of ruling during difficult times. Moving even more carefully now, Isabella edged closer to where the voices were coming from. The fog was beginning to thin slightly, and she could make out the dark shapes of two figures standing near a large oak tree about 30 feet ahead of her. One was definitely Lady Margaret, her distinctive silver hair visible even through the mist. The other was a man Isabella didn't immediately recognize, tall and wearing a dark coat that made him blend into the shadows. Isabella raised her camera instinctively, the way she always did when she wanted to get a better look at something. The powerful zoom lens that Uncle Marcus had helped her choose was designed for wildlife photography, capable of capturing clear images from great distances. As she adjusted the focus, the two figures became much clearer in her viewfinder. The man was someone she had seen before, but couldn't quite place. He had the bearing of a government official, with short gray hair and the kind of expensive clothing that spoke of high position and significant influence. There was something familiar about his profile, but Isabella couldn't quite remember where she had seen him. The princess's photography hobby could pose a problem, Lady Margaret was saying, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. She's been wandering the grounds more frequently lately, and she has that camera with her constantly. Children see things differently than adults do. They notice details that we might miss. Isabella's heart nearly stopped. They were talking about her. Somehow, her innocent hobby had become something these people saw as a threat to whatever secret they were protecting. Isabella is just a child, the man replied dismissively. What could she possibly understand about affairs of state? Besides, she spends most of her time photographing flowers and birds. I hardly think she poses any real danger to our operations. Don't underestimate her, Lady Margaret warned. I've watched that girl grow up, and she's far more perceptive than people give her credit for. Her Uncle Marcus has been encouraging her curiosity, teaching her to look beneath the surface of things. If she were to stumble across something, then we ensure that she doesn't, the man said firmly. The stakes are too high to leave anything to chance. The Meridian Accords must remain buried, and anyone who might threaten that security must be dealt with appropriately. There was something in a way he said, dealt with appropriately, that made Isabella's blood run cold. She might be only 12 years old, but she was smart enough to understand the implied threat in those words. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Isabella pressed the shutter button on her camera. The advanced autofocus system locked onto the two figures instantly, and the camera's nearly silent shutter captured the image before either of the conspirators noticed anything unusual. But as Isabella lowered the camera, her elbow accidentally brushed against a low-hanging branch, sending a shower of water droplets to the ground below. The sound was small, barely noticeable under normal circumstances, but in the intense quiet of the fog-shrouded morning, it might as well have been a gunshot. Both figures turned toward her location immediately, and Isabella realized with growing terror that she had been discovered. "What was that?" the man demanded, his voice sharp with alarm. "Someone's there," Lady Margaret replied, her tone now completely cold and businesslike. "In the trees, about 30 meters to our left." Isabella didn't wait to hear any more. Clutching her camera tightly to her chest, she turned and began running back along the path as fast as she dared in the treacherous fog. Behind her, she could hear the sound of footsteps and voices as the two conspirators began to pursue her. The fog that had seemed so beautiful and mysterious just minutes before now felt like a trap, making it impossible to see where she was going and causing her to stumble repeatedly over roots and rocks that she couldn't see until she was practically on top of them. Her camera bounced against her ribs with each step, but she held onto it tightly, instinctively understanding that whatever she had just witnessed and photographed was of vital importance. As she ran, Isabella's mind raced with everything she had overheard. The Meridian Accords, whatever they were, had something to do with events from 20 years ago, around the time of her grandfather's death. Lady Margaret and her unknown companion were planning to destroy documents that could apparently damage the monarchy if they became public. And, most terrifying of all, they saw Isabella herself as a potential threat to their plans. The path seemed endless as she fled through the fog. But, finally, Isabella began to recognize landmarks that told her she was approaching the formal palace grounds. The sound of pursuit had faded behind her, suggesting that either her pursuers had given up or they had lost her trail in the thick mist. Isabella didn't stop running until she reached the main palace building, bursting through the doors with her heart pounding and her breathing ragged. Thomas Hartwell was still at his post near the entrance, and he looked up in alarm as the disheveled princess stumbled into the main hall. "Your Highness!" Thomas exclaimed, immediately moving toward her with concern written across his face. "What's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Isabella looked up at Thomas, this man who had been a constant, reassuring presence throughout her childhood, and felt a moment of overwhelming relief. But even as she opened her mouth to tell him everything she had witnessed, she hesitated. Lady Margaret had been talking about ensuring that people who posed threats to their plans were dealt with appropriately. How could Isabella know who else might be involved in this conspiracy? I got lost in the fog," Isabella said finally, the lie feeling strange on her tongue. "I couldn't see where I was going, and I think I panicked a little." Thomas studied her face carefully, his experienced eye noting details that suggested there was more to the story than she was telling him. But he also recognized the fear in her eyes, and his protective instincts kicked in immediately. "You're safe now," he said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Why don't we get you upstairs to your rooms? You can warm up and maybe have some breakfast sent up." Isabella nodded gratefully, but as Thomas escorted her toward the main staircase, she clutched her camera tightly against her chest. Whatever was on the memory card inside this device, it was important enough that powerful people were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it secret. As they climbed the stairs, Isabella's mind was already working on her next move. She needed to understand what the Meridian Accords were and why they were so dangerous that people she had trusted her entire life were willing to betray her father to keep them hidden. She needed to figure out who she could trust with this information, and she needed to do it quickly before Lady Margaret and her allies realized that their secret meeting had been photographed. But most importantly, Isabella realized as they reached the top of the stairs, and Thomas bid her goodbye with a gentle smile, she needed to stay alive long enough to expose whatever conspiracy was threatening her family and her kingdom. The game had begun, though Isabella didn't yet understand all the rules. All she knew was that a simple morning photography session had suddenly become a matter of life and death, and the evidence that could save or destroy the monarchy was now stored safely on the memory card of her camera. As Thomas disappeared back down the stairs, and Isabella entered her private chambers, she carefully removed the memory card from her camera and held it up to the light. Such a small thing, barely larger than her thumbnail, but containing secrets that people were apparently willing to kill for. The fog outside her window was finally beginning to lift, revealing the familiar landscape of the palace grounds in the growing morning light. But for Isabella, nothing would ever look the same again. She had crossed a line that morning, stepped from the innocent world of childhood into the dangerous realm of adult conspiracies and political intrigue. And there was no going back. Isabella spent the rest of that morning in her chambers, her mind racing with questions and fears that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. She had hidden the memory card inside a small jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother, tucking it beneath a false bottom that she had discovered years earlier during one of her childhood explorations. The camera itself sat on her desk, looking innocent and ordinary, giving no hint of the dangerous secret it had helped her uncover. Several times throughout the morning, Isabella found herself moving to the window, watching the palace grounds for any sign of unusual activity. The fog had completely lifted by 10 o'clock, revealing the familiar landscape that had been her playground since childhood. But now those same gardens and pathways held new meaning, potential hiding places for conspirators, and secrets that could destroy everything she held dear. Around noon, there was a soft knock on her door, followed by the entrance of Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, the palace's head of household staff. Mrs. Pemberton had been with the royal family for over 20 years, arriving shortly after Isabella's birth, and had always been a motherly figure to the royal children. She was a woman of middle years with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and kind eyes that missed very little of what went on within the palace walls. "Your Highness," Mrs. Pemberton said with a slight curtsy, carrying a silver tray laden with Isabella's favorite lunch items. "I thought you might be hungry. Cook prepared your favorite sandwiches, and there's fresh fruit from the greenhouse." Isabella smiled gratefully, realizing for the first time that she was indeed hungry. The morning's events had been so overwhelming that she had completely forgotten about breakfast, and her stomach was now reminding her of that oversight. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton," Isabella said, gesturing for the older woman to set the tray on the small table near her window. "That's very thoughtful of you." As Mrs. Pemberton arranged the food, she glanced at Isabella with the perceptive eyes of someone who had spent decades caring for children. "You seem a bit out of sorts today, dear. Is everything all right?" Isabella hesitated, torn between her desperate need to confide in someone and her growing awareness that trust was now a luxury she could not afford carelessly. Mrs. Pemberton had always been a safe harbor in the often turbulent waters of palace life, but Lady Margaret had also been someone Isabella trusted completely until this morning. "I'm fine," Isabella said finally. "Just thinking about some things." Mrs. Pemberton nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Well, if you need anything at all, you know where to find me. Your mother mentioned that she'll be tied up in meetings for most of the afternoon, but she's planning to have tea with you around 4 o'clock. After Mrs. Pemberton left, Isabella ate her lunch mechanically while her mind continued to wrestle with the morning's revelations. She needed to learn more about the Meridian Accords, but she had no idea where to begin her research. The palace library contained thousands of books and documents, but most of the truly sensitive governmental materials were kept in her father's private study, a room that was strictly off-limits to the royal children. As she finished eating, Isabella remembered something Uncle Marcus had told her during one of his visits. He had mentioned that the palace staff, particularly those who had been there for many years, often knew more about the true workings of the kingdom than anyone realized. "Servants see everything and hear everything," he had said with a knowing smile. "They just usually pretend not to notice." With this thought in mind, Isabella decided to venture out of her chambers and begin her own investigation. She changed from her riding clothes into a simple day dress, one that would help her blend in more easily with the palace routine, and set out to explore areas of the palace she rarely visited. Her first stop was the servants' quarters in the basement level of the palace, a maze of corridors and rooms that housed the laundry facilities, storage areas, and staff common rooms. Isabella had only been down here a few times in her life, usually when she was very young and playing hide and seek with her brother Alexander. The basement corridors were dimly lit and filled with the sounds of activity, washing machines running, staff members chatting as they went about their duties, and the general bustle of the behind-the-scenes operations that kept the palace functioning. Isabella moved carefully through the maze, trying to look like she belonged, while actually searching for anyone who might have been working at the palace 20 years ago when the Meridian Accords were apparently signed. It was in the main laundry room that she found Agnes Whitmore, an elderly woman who had been with the palace staff for over 30 years. Agnes was Professor Whitmore's aunt, Isabella recalled, the professor who tutored her brother in Latin and ancient history. Agnes was a small, bird-like woman with silver hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. "Your Highness!" Agnes exclaimed in surprise when she noticed Isabella standing in the doorway of the laundry room. "What brings you down to our domain?" Isabella had prepared a cover story during her walk through the corridors. "I'm working on a photography project about the different parts of the palace," she said, holding up her camera. "I thought it might be interesting to document the areas that people don't usually see." Agnes smiled approvingly. What a wonderful idea, dear. The palace has so many hidden corners and forgotten spaces. I've been working here for 32 years, and I still discover new things from time to time. 32 years, Isabella repeated, her heart beginning to beat faster. That means you were here when my grandfather was still king. Agnes's expression softened with memory. Oh yes, I remember King William well. Such a kind man, though he carried heavy burdens. Those were difficult times for the kingdom, with all the negotiations and treaties being signed. Your grandfather worked himself to exhaustion trying to secure peace and prosperity for Valdoria. Isabella seized on this opening. What kind of treaties? I know there were several important agreements signed during his reign, but I've never learned much about the details. Agnes glanced around the laundry room, as if making sure they weren't being overheard, then moved closer to Isabella. Well, there was the famous Peace of Ravens Hollow, which ended the border disputes with our northern neighbors, and the Trade Compact of 2003, which opened new markets for our agricultural products. But the most important one, the one that really secured our kingdom's future, was the Meridian Accords. Isabella's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to appear only casually interested. The Meridian Accords? I don't think I've ever heard of those. Agnes looked surprised. Really? Well, I suppose it's not something that gets talked about much anymore. It was a very complex agreement between several kingdoms designed to prevent future wars and establish new trade relationships. Your grandfather negotiated it personally, spent months in secret meetings with representatives from other royal houses. Secret meetings? Isabella asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh yes, very hush-hush, Agnes confirmed, warming to her subject. The negotiations were so sensitive that only a handful of people knew the full details. Your grandfather was under tremendous stress during those months, barely sleeping, constantly worried about whether he was making the right decisions for the kingdom. Agnes paused in her work, her expression growing sad. It was shortly after the accords were signed that your grandfather had his heart attack. The poor man had worked himself to death, trying to secure peace for all of us. Isabella felt a cold chill run down her spine. According to what she had overheard that morning, the Meridian Accords were something that needed to be kept secret, something that could damage the monarchy if they became public. But Agnes spoke of them as if they had been a great achievement, something her grandfather had sacrificed his health to accomplish. Do you know what happened to the original documents? Isabella asked, trying to sound casual. I mean, are they kept in the royal archives somewhere? Agnes shook her head slowly. That's the strange thing, dear. After your grandfather's death, all the original documents seemed to disappear. Your father looked for them when he took the throne, wanted to understand exactly what his father had committed the kingdom to, but they were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had never existed. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place in Isabella's mind. Her grandfather had negotiated the Meridian Accords in secret, then died shortly afterward. The original documents had mysteriously vanished, and now, 20 years later, people like Lady Margaret were working to ensure that no evidence of the Accords ever surfaced. But why? What was in those agreements that was worth covering up? Your Highness! Agnes's voice broke through Isabella's racing thoughts. Are you feeling all right? You look a bit pale. Isabella forced a smile. I'm fine, just fascinated by the history. Thank you for telling me about all this, Agnes. It helps me understand my grandfather better. As Isabella made her way back through the basement corridors, her mind was spinning with new questions and theories. She needed to find out more about the Meridian Accords, but she also needed to be extremely careful about who she trusted with her inquiries. If Agnes was right about the documents disappearing after her grandfather's death, then the cover-up had been going on for 2 decades, involving people at the highest levels of government. Isabella's next stop was the Palace Library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with books, documents, and historical records. The library was one of her favorite places in the palace, a sanctuary where she could lose herself in stories and histories from around the world. Today, however, she approached it with a specific mission in mind. The librarian, Mr. Jonathan Ashford, was a scholarly man in his 50s who had been with the palace for about 15 years. He knew Isabella well from her frequent visits, and always seemed pleased to help her find books on whatever subject had captured her interest. "Good afternoon, Your Highness, Mr. Ashford greeted her with a warm smile as she entered the library. "What can I help you find today?" Isabella had decided on a careful approach. "I'm working on a project about the major treaties and agreements that have shaped Valdoria's relationships with other kingdoms. I was hoping to find some historical documents about the various peace accords and trade agreements from my grandfather's reign." Mr. Ashford's eyes lit up with academic enthusiasm. An excellent topic of study. King William's reign was indeed marked by several important diplomatic achievements. "Let me show you to the appropriate section." He led Isabella to a corner of the library where several large volumes were housed, containing copies of various treaties and diplomatic documents from the past century. As they walked, Mr. Ashford discussed some of the more well-known agreements, including the Peace of Ravens Hollow and the trade compact that Agnes had mentioned. "However," he continued as they reached the historical documents section, "you should be aware that some of the more sensitive diplomatic materials from that period are not available in the general library collection. They would be housed in the restricted archives, which requires special permission to access." "What kind of documents would be restricted?" Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Oh, various things. Preliminary negotiations, documents involving intelligence operations, agreements that might still be considered sensitive from a national security standpoint. For instance, I believe there were some accords negotiated during your grandfather's final months that were classified at such a high level that even I've never seen the actual documents." Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. "What were they called?" Mr. Ashford paused, clearly thinking. "I believe they were referred to as the Meridian Accords, though I may be misremembering the exact name. As I said, the details were kept very quiet, even within the palace." Isabella spent the next hour reviewing the available diplomatic documents from her grandfather's reign, but, as she had expected, there was no mention of the Meridian Accords anywhere in the accessible materials. Whatever those agreements contained, they had been successfully erased from the official historical record. As she read through various treaties and trade agreements, Isabella began to develop a better understanding of the political landscape during her grandfather's time. Valdoria had been surrounded by larger, more powerful kingdoms that posed constant threats to its independence. Her grandfather had used diplomacy and careful negotiation to navigate these dangers, but it had clearly taken a tremendous toll on his health and well-being. Around 4 o'clock, Isabella made her way to her mother's private sitting room for their planned tea. Queen Elena was a woman of grace and intelligence, with the kind of natural poise that made her perfect for royal duties. She had married Isabella's father when they were both young, and had grown into her role as queen with dignity and compassion. The sitting room was one of the most comfortable spaces in the palace, decorated with soft colors and filled with family photographs and personal mementos that made it feel more like a home than a royal residence. Queen Elena was already seated at the small table when Isabella arrived, having changed from her formal attire into a simple blue dress that complemented her graying blonde hair. "Isabella, darling," the queen said, rising to embrace her daughter. "I've been looking forward to this all day. The meetings have been absolutely exhausting." As they settled in for tea, Isabella studied her mother's face, looking for any signs of stress or concern that might be related to the conspiracy she had uncovered. Queen Elena did appear tired, with subtle lines of worry around her eyes that Isabella hadn't noticed before. "What kind of meetings were you in today?" Isabella asked, trying to sound casually interested. Queen Elena sighed as she poured tea from the elegant china service. "Oh, the usual governmental business. Preparations for the upcoming diplomatic summit, budget discussions, that sort of thing. Your father has been working incredibly hard lately, trying to ensure that everything goes smoothly when the other royal families arrive next week." Isabella's attention sharpened. The man she had overheard that morning had mentioned that the summit began in 3 days and that all evidence of the Meridian Accords needed to be eliminated before then. "What's special about this particular summit? Is it different from the usual diplomatic meetings?" "Yes, actually, it is quite significant," Queen Elena replied, settling back in her chair with her teacup. It's the 20th anniversary of several important treaties that your grandfather negotiated shortly before his death. The other kingdoms want to review and potentially update some of those agreements to reflect the changed circumstances of the past 2 decades. Isabella felt as if someone had just dropped ice into her stomach. If foreign representatives were coming to review treaties from 20 years ago, they would certainly be asking questions about the Meridian Accords. No wonder Lady Margaret and her allies were desperate to ensure that no evidence of those agreements survived. Will all the original documents be reviewed? Isabella asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil in her mind. Queen Elena's expression grew slightly troubled. That's actually been one of the challenges in preparing for the summit. Some of the original documents from that period seem to have been misplaced over the years. Your father has been quite frustrated about it, actually. He feels it's important to have complete records when dealing with such sensitive diplomatic matters. Has he asked Lady Margaret to help find the missing documents? Isabella asked, watching her mother's face carefully for any reaction. Oh yes, Margaret has been absolutely tireless in her efforts, Queen Elena said, her expression brightening. She's been coordinating with all the relevant departments, checking archives, even interviewing staff members who might remember where certain documents were stored. If anyone can locate the missing materials, it's Margaret. Isabella nodded, but inside she felt sick. Lady Margaret wasn't trying to find the missing documents. She was making sure they remained lost forever. And Isabella's mother, who clearly trusted Lady Margaret completely, had no idea that her closest advisor was engaged in an elaborate deception. As they continued their tea and conversation, Isabella found herself studying her mother with new eyes. Queen Elena was intelligent and dedicated, but she was also trusting to a fault. She believed in the goodness of people around her and would never suspect that someone like Lady Margaret could be engaged in treachery. This realization filled Isabella with a new sense of responsibility and fear. If the adults around her couldn't see the danger, then it was up to her to expose the conspiracy and protect her family. But she was only 12 years old, and she was dealing with people who had decades of experience in political manipulation and deception. After tea, Isabella returned to her chambers and retrieved the memory card from its hiding place. She inserted it in her laptop and opened the photograph she had taken that morning. The image was clear and detailed, showing Lady Margaret and the unknown man in obvious conversation in what was clearly a secret meeting. But Isabella realized that while the photograph proved that the meeting had taken place, it didn't prove what they had been discussing. Without audio recording of their conversation, the image alone would not be enough to expose their conspiracy. She needed more evidence, something that would definitively prove that Lady Margaret and her allies were working against the royal family's interests. As Isabella sat staring at the photograph on her computer screen, she began to formulate a plan. The summit was 3 days away, which meant that Lady Margaret and her co-conspirators would likely be making final preparations to ensure that all evidence of the Meridian Accords was destroyed. If Isabella could somehow observe their activities, maybe even record another conversation, she might be able to gather the proof she needed. But the plan would require her to take enormous risks. These people had already demonstrated that they were willing to go to extreme lengths to protect their secret, and they had specifically mentioned that Isabella herself was a potential threat. If they discovered that she was actively investigating them, there was no telling how far they might go to silence her. Isabella looked out her window at the palace grounds, now bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. In just a few hours, it would be dark, and under cover of darkness, she might be able to move around the palace without being noticed. If she could find out where Lady Margaret and her allies were meeting, she might be able to gather the evidence she needed to expose their conspiracy. But as she began to plan her nocturnal investigation, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to cross another line, one that would take her even further from the safe, innocent world of her childhood and deeper into the dangerous realm of adult secrets and political intrigue. The memory card in her hand seemed to pulse with potential energy, a small piece of technology that contained the power to save or destroy everything she held dear. The question that remained was whether she would have the courage to use that power and whether she would be able to stay alive long enough to see justice done. Outside her window, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the palace grounds and marking the end of what had been the most frightening day of Isabella's young life. But she had a feeling that the real danger was only just beginning as darkness fell over Ravencrest Palace. Isabella prepared for what she knew would be the most dangerous night of her life. She had spent the hours since tea carefully planning her investigation, studying the palace layout in her mind, and trying to anticipate where Lady Margaret and her conspirators might meet to coordinate their final preparations before the summit. Isabella dressed entirely in black, dark pants, and a long-sleeve shirt that would help her blend into the shadows. She retrieved her camera from its case, checking to ensure that the battery was fully charged and that she had set all the controls for low-light photography. Uncle Marcus had taught her how to use the camera's advanced night vision capabilities, though she had never imagined she would need those skills for anything more dangerous than photographing nocturnal wildlife in the palace gardens. Around 11 o'clock, when the palace had settled into its nighttime routine, Isabella carefully opened her bedroom door and peered into the corridor. The hallways were dimly lit by strategically placed sconces that provided just enough illumination for safe navigation while conserving energy during the overnight hours. She could hear the distant sound of the night shift guards making their rounds, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors in a rhythm she had memorized from years of living in the palace. Isabella slipped out of her room and began making her way through the corridors, moving as silently as possible and staying close to the walls where the shadows were deepest. Her destination was the administrative wing of the palace, where Lady Margaret's office was located along with the offices of other senior government officials. If the conspirators were meeting tonight, Isabella reasoned, it would likely be in a location that would provide both privacy and access to any documents or communication systems they might need. The administrative wing was on the opposite side of the palace from Isabella's chambers, requiring her to navigate through several main corridors and past multiple guard stations. She had planned her route carefully, timing her movements to avoid the regular patrol schedules and using servants' passages where possible to minimize her chances of being discovered. As she moved through the palace, Isabella's mind raced with everything she had learned about the Meridian Accords and the conspiracy surrounding them. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that the missing documents contained something that would be devastating to the kingdom if revealed. But what could be so damaging that people were willing to betray the crown to keep it hidden? Isabella's first challenge came as she approached the main corridor that led to the administrative wing. 2 guards were stationed at the entrance, their attention focused on a card game they were playing to pass the time during the quiet overnight hours. Isabella crouched in the shadows at the end of the hallway, watching their movements and trying to figure out how to get past them without being seen. After several minutes of observation, Isabella noticed that the guards periodically stepped away from their station to check other parts of their assigned area. When both men left their post to investigate a noise from one of the nearby rooms, Isabella seized her opportunity and sprinted across the open corridor, pressing herself against the wall on the far side just as the guards returned to their station. The administrative wing was even darker than the residential areas of the palace, with only emergency lighting providing minimal illumination. Isabella used her camera's night vision capability to navigate through the maze of offices and conference rooms, searching for any sign of activity or unusual lights that might indicate where the conspirators were meeting. It was as she passed Lady Margaret's personal office that Isabella noticed a thin strip of light visible beneath the door of a conference room at the end of the hallway. Moving carefully toward the light, she could begin to make out the sound of voices engaged in urgent conversation. Isabella approached the conference room door with her heart pounding, remembering all too clearly what had happened that morning when she had been discovered eavesdropping in the gardens. But this time she was better prepared, with a camera capable of recording both video and audio from a safe distance. The conference room door was solid wood with no windows, but there was a ventilation grate near the floor that might provide both visual and audio access to the meeting inside. Isabella crept toward the grate, positioning herself so that she could see through the metal slats while remaining hidden in the darkened hallway. Through the ventilation grate, Isabella could see 4 people seated around a large conference table. Lady Margaret was there, along with the man from the morning meeting whom Isabella still didn't recognize. The other 2 participants made Isabella's blood run cold. One was General Harrison Blackstone, the head of the kingdom's military forces, and a man Isabella had known since childhood. And the other was Lord Chancellor Robert Whitehall, her father's chief legal advisor, and one of the most trusted members of the royal government. The scope of the conspiracy was far larger than Isabella had imagined. These weren't just a few rogue officials working on their own. This was a coordinated effort involving some of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Isabella carefully positioned her camera near the ventilation grate, adjusting the settings to record both video and audio of the meeting. The advanced microphone system that Uncle Marcus had insisted on was sensitive enough to pick up conversations through barriers like the metal grating, and the low-light video capabilities would capture clear images of the participants even in the dimly lit conference room. The final phase begins tomorrow, General Blackstone was saying as Isabella began her recording. All remaining documents must be destroyed before the foreign delegations arrive. We cannot afford to have even a single page of the original Meridian Accord survive. What about the king's inquiries? Lord Chancellor Whitehall asked, his voice tense with worry. Edmund has been asking increasingly specific questions about the missing documents. If he becomes suspicious, Edmund will never learn the truth, Lady Margaret said firmly. We've maintained this deception for 20 years, and we're not going to fail now when we're so close to permanent security. Remind me again why we're taking such extreme measures, the unknown man said. Isabella could now see his face clearly through the camera's viewfinder, though she still couldn't identify him. The Meridian Accords were signed 2 decades ago. Why is their exposure still such a threat? General Blackstone leaned forward, his expression grim. Because the terms of those accords would destroy everything this kingdom stands for. When King William negotiated those agreements, he was desperate to prevent war with our neighboring kingdoms. But the price he paid, the concessions he made, if they became public, it would mean the end of Valdoria as an independent nation. Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. Whatever her grandfather had agreed to in the Meridian Accords, it was apparently so damaging that it could threaten the very existence of their kingdom. Specifically, Lady Margaret continued, the Accords contained provisions that would have essentially made Valdoria a vassal state to the Northern Alliance. In exchange for peace, King William agreed to terms that would have given foreign powers control over our military, our economy, and ultimately our government. He was planning to present these terms to Parliament and the people as a temporary measure, but he died before he could implement them. So you simply buried them? The unknown man asked. We saved the kingdom, Lord Chancellor Whitehall said defensively. When King William died and Edmund took the throne, we realized that revealing the true terms of the Meridian Accords would have led to revolution. The people would never have accepted foreign rule, even temporarily. So we made the decision to hide the documents and allow Edmund to rule as if the Accords had never existed. Isabella's mind reeled with the implications of what she was hearing. Her grandfather had apparently signed agreements that would have surrendered Valdoria's independence, but the very people who were now supposed to be protecting the kingdom had hidden this fact from her father and allowed him to rule without knowledge of commitments that were apparently still binding. But the other kingdoms know about the Accords, General Blackstone continued. They've been patient for 20 years, but they're not going to wait much longer. The summit is their way of giving us one final opportunity to honor the original agreements voluntarily. If we can't produce the documents and claim they never existed, they might be willing to negotiate new terms that are more favorable to Valdoria. And if they're not willing to negotiate, the unknown man asked. Lady Margaret's expression grew cold. Then, we'll deal with that situation when it arises. But under no circumstances can the original Meridian Accords ever be revealed. Too many people have worked too hard to build the Valdoria we have today. We won't let the mistakes of the past destroy our future. Isabella continued recording as the conspirators discussed their plans in detail. They had systematically destroyed most of the original documents over the years, but they were concerned that copies might exist in foreign archives or in the personal papers of diplomats who had been involved in the original negotiations. The summit was being used as an opportunity to identify and eliminate any remaining evidence. "What about the princess?" General Blackstone asked suddenly, and Isabella felt her heart skip a beat. "Lady Margaret mentioned this morning that she's been taking photographs around the palace grounds. Could she pose a security risk?" "Isabella is just a child with a hobby," Lord Chancellor Whitehall said dismissively. "I hardly think a 12-year-old girl represents a serious threat to national security." "Don't underestimate her," Lady Margaret warned, her voice sharp. "I've been watching that girl for years, and she's far more intelligent and observant than people give her credit for. Her photography isn't just a hobby. She has a genuine talent for seeing things that others miss. And her uncle Marcus has been encouraging her to ask questions and investigate things that catch her interest." "Marcus has always been a problem," General Blackstone muttered. "He asks too many questions and shows too much interest in historical documents. If he weren't the king's brother." "Marcus is currently in the northern provinces on official business," Lady Margaret said. "He won't return until after the summit is concluded. By then, all of this will be resolved." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't realized that Uncle Marcus was away from the capital, which meant that the one adult she had been counting on to help her was unavailable when she needed him most. "Nevertheless," Lady Margaret continued, "we should monitor the princess's activities closely over the next few days. If she stumbles across anything that could compromise our operations, we'll need to take appropriate action." "What kind of appropriate action?" the unknown man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Whatever is necessary to protect the kingdom," General Blackstone said flatly. "The stakes are too high to let personal feelings interfere with our duty." Isabella realized with growing terror that these people, who had known her since birth and had always presented themselves as protectors of the royal family, were now discussing the possibility of harming her if she became a threat to their conspiracy. The idea that people she had trusted completely could even consider taking action against her was almost too horrifying to comprehend. The meeting continued for another hour, with the conspirators discussing specific plans for destroying remaining documents and coordinating their responses to questions from the foreign delegations. Isabella recorded everything, building a comprehensive record of their treachery that would provide undeniable proof of their actions. As the meeting began to wind down, Isabella knew she needed to retreat before the conspirators left the conference room and potentially discovered her presence in the hallway. She carefully packed up her camera and began making her way back toward the residential wing of the palace, her mind racing with everything she had learned. The evidence she had gathered was explosive, but it also placed her in incredible danger. These weren't just minor officials engaging in petty corruption. They were some of the most powerful people in the kingdom, and they had already demonstrated their willingness to take extreme measures to protect their secret. As Isabella navigated through the dark corridors, she began to formulate a plan for what she needed to do next. The evidence she had gathered would need to be presented to someone who could act on it, but she now knew that many of the people she would normally trust were actually part of the conspiracy. She couldn't go to Lady Margaret, obviously, and General Blackstone and Lord Chancellor Whitehall were also compromised. The obvious choice was to go directly to her father, King Edmund, but Isabella hesitated. The conspirators had spent 20 years protecting him from the truth about the Meridian Accords, and revealing everything now would not only destroy his trust in his closest advisors, but also force him to confront the fact that his entire reign had been built on a foundation of lies and deception. Moreover, Isabella wasn't entirely certain that she could trust her father to handle the information appropriately. King Edmund was a good man, but he was also honorable to a fault. If he learned about the Meridian Accords, he might feel obligated to honor the original agreements his father had signed, even if doing so would destroy the kingdom. As Isabella finally reached her chambers and locked the door behind her, she realized that the weight of the kingdom's future was now resting on her 12-year-old shoulders. She was the only person who knew the full scope of the conspiracy, and she was the only one in a position to expose it before the summit began, and the conspirators either succeeded in their deception or were forced to take even more drastic measures. Isabella downloaded the video files from her camera and stored them on multiple devices, including uploading copies to a secure cloud storage service that Uncle Marcus had taught her to use. She also wrote out a detailed summary of everything she had learned, creating multiple copies and hiding them in different locations throughout her chambers. As dawn approached, Isabella finally allowed herself to rest, but sleep was elusive. Every shadow in her room seemed to hide a potential threat, and every sound in the palace corridors made her wonder if the conspirators had discovered her activities and were coming to silence her. The summit would begin in just 2 days, and Isabella knew that time was running out. She needed to find a way to expose the conspiracy and protect her family, but she was still just a child facing adults who had decades of experience in political manipulation and were apparently willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. The evidence she had gathered was powerful, but it would only be useful if she could find a way to present it to someone who could act on it without alerting the conspirators to her activities. Isabella stared at the ceiling of her bedroom as the first light of dawn began to filter through her windows, knowing that the next day would determine not only her own fate, but the future of the entire kingdom. The game of shadows and secrets that had begun with a simple morning photography session was now approaching its climax, and Isabella was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. She had become its most dangerous enemy, and the only person standing between the kingdom and the destruction that would follow if the truth remained buried. But she was also 12 years old, alone, and facing forces that had been planning and scheming since before she was born. The question that haunted her as she finally drifted off to an uneasy sleep was whether courage and determination would be enough to overcome the odds stacked against her, or whether she was about to become another victim of the dark secrets that lay at the heart of Valdoria's royal history. Isabella woke before dawn after only a few hours of restless sleep, her mind immediately snapping to full alertness as she remembered the events of the previous night. Today was the day before the summit would begin, which meant it was likely the last opportunity for the conspirators to complete their preparations and destroy any remaining evidence of the Meridian Accords. But it was also Isabella's last chance to expose their treachery before it was too late to prevent whatever catastrophic consequences might follow from their success. As Isabella dressed for what she knew would be the most important day of her young life, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She was going to tell her father everything, regardless of the personal and political consequences. King Edmund deserved to know the truth about the conspiracy that had shaped his entire reign, and the kingdom deserved to know what had really happened 20 years ago when the Meridian Accord was signed. But first, Isabella needed to ensure that her evidence would survive even if something happened to her. She spent the early morning hours creating additional copies of the photographs and video recordings, hiding them in locations throughout the palace that only she knew about. She also wrote detailed letters explaining everything she had discovered, addressing them to several people she trusted, including Uncle Marcus, Thomas Hartwell, and even Agnes Whitmore, the elderly laundry worker who had provided her with crucial information about the Accords. Isabella's plan was to approach her father during his regular morning walk in the private royal gardens, a time when he was typically alone and reflective, without the presence of advisors who might be part of the conspiracy. She gathered all her evidence into a leather satchel that had belonged to her grandfather, feeling that it was somehow appropriate to use King William's own bag to carry the proof of how his legacy had been manipulated. Around 8 o'clock, Isabella made her way to the royal gardens, timing her arrival to coincide with her father's usual morning routine. King Edmund was indeed there, walking slowly along the path that wound between the ancient rose bushes that had been planted by generations of Valdoria monarchs. He looked older than Isabella remembered, with lines of stress around his eyes and a weariness in his bearing that spoke of the tremendous pressures he had been under. "Father," Isabella called out as she approached, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. King Edmund turned with a smile that immediately brightened his tired features. "Isabella, what brings you to the gardens so early this morning?" Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that there was no going back once she began. "I need to tell you something very important. Something about Lady Margaret and General Blackstone and the Meridian Accords." The change in her father's expression was immediate and dramatic. The warm smile disappeared, replaced by a look of sharp attention and growing concern. "What do you know about the Meridian Accords?" "I know that they really existed," Isabella said, moving closer to her father and speaking in a low voice. "I know that grandfather signed them shortly before he died, and I know that certain people in your government have been hiding them from you for 20 years. King Edmund stared at his daughter for a long moment, his face cycling through expressions of surprise, disbelief, and, finally, a kind of grim resignation. "How could you possibly know about something like that?" Isabella opened her satchel and removed the photographs she had taken of Lady Margaret's secret meeting, along with copies of the video recordings from the conference room. "Because I've been investigating them, and because I have proof of what's been happening." For the next hour, Isabella told her father everything. She described the morning when she had accidentally discovered Lady Margaret's meeting in the fog, the conversation she had overheard about destroying documents, and the late-night conference where the full scope of the conspiracy had been revealed. She showed him the photographs and played portions of the audio recordings, watching as her father's expression grew increasingly dark with each new revelation. King Edmund listened without interruption, his face betraying the profound shock and betrayal he felt as he learned that some of his most trusted advisors had been deceiving him throughout his entire reign. When Isabella finished her account, he sat down heavily on a stone bench, looking as if the weight of the world had suddenly settled on his shoulders. "Do you understand what this means?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Isabella nodded gravely. "It means that the kingdom you've been ruling might not actually be independent. It means that there are agreements out there that could force us to surrender our sovereignty to foreign powers. And it means that some of the people you trust most have been lying to you for 20 years. King Edmund was quiet for several minutes, staring at the evidence Isabella had gathered while his mind processed the implications of everything he had learned. Finally, he looked up at his daughter with an expression of profound sadness mixed with fierce pride. "You realize how dangerous this information is," he said, "and how much danger you've put yourself in by gathering it." "I know," Isabella replied, "but I also know that the summit starts tomorrow, and that Lady Margaret and the others are planning to use it to eliminate any remaining evidence. If we don't act now, the truth might be buried forever." King Edmund stood up slowly, his expression hardening with resolve. "Then, we need to move quickly. But we also need to be very careful about who we trust. If this conspiracy is as extensive as you believe, then we don't know how many people might be involved." Isabella felt a surge of relief at her father's reaction. She had been afraid that he might refuse to believe her or might decide that the truth was too dangerous to reveal. Instead, he was treating her as an equal partner in addressing the crisis, trusting her judgment and valuing her evidence. "What should we do first?" Isabella asked. King Edmund thought carefully before answering. "We need to secure additional proof before we make any accusations. Your evidence is compelling, but we need to be absolutely certain of our facts before we move against people at this level of government. More importantly, we need to find out if copies of the original Meridian Accords still exist somewhere." Isabella remembered something from the previous night's recording. General Blackstone mentioned that the other kingdoms might have copies in their archives. He said they've been patient for 20 years, but they're not going to wait much longer. "Which means they'll be bringing their copies to the summit," King Edmund said grimly. "They'll expect us to honor the original agreements. And when we can't produce our copies, they'll present theirs." Father and daughter spent the rest of the morning developing a strategy for exposing the conspiracy while protecting themselves from retaliation. King Edmund had a few loyal allies within the government, people who had been with the royal family for decades and whose loyalty was beyond question. Chief among these was Sir Richard Pembroke, the deputy commander of the Royal Guard, who had served the crown faithfully for over 25 years. Isabella also suggested involving Thomas Hartwell, the guard who had always been kind to her and who had noticed her distress after her encounter with the conspirators in the fog. King Edmund agreed that Thomas's observations and insights could be valuable, especially since he was in a position to monitor the movements and activities of other palace staff. By noon, they had assembled a small team of trusted individuals who could help them investigate the conspiracy further and prepare for the confrontation that would inevitably come when the truth was revealed. Sir Richard brought years of experience in security and intelligence operations, while Thomas provided detailed knowledge of the palace's daily routines and the behavior patterns of the people who worked there. The investigation that followed was swift and methodical. Sir Richard's contacts within the government intelligence services confirmed that suspicious communications had been detected between certain high-ranking officials and foreign representatives. Thomas reported unusual activity in the administrative wing of the palace, with several offices being visited during overnight hours by people who normally had no reason to be there. Most importantly, they discovered that Lady Margaret had been in regular contact with representatives from the Northern Alliance kingdoms, the very nations that would benefit most from the enforcement of the original Meridian Accords. The communications were carefully coded, but Sir Richard's intelligence experts were able to determine that they involved detailed discussions about the upcoming summit and the resolution of outstanding diplomatic obligations. As the day progressed, Isabella found herself at the center of an intelligence operation that was far more complex and dangerous than anything she could have imagined when she first picked up her camera 3 days earlier. But she also felt a growing sense of purpose and determination. The skills that Uncle Marcus had taught her about observation and investigation were proving invaluable, and her unique perspective as someone who could move around the palace without attracting suspicion was providing crucial insights. The crucial breakthrough came in the late afternoon when Sir Richard's team intercepted a communication between Lady Margaret and her contact in the Northern Alliance. The message confirmed that the foreign delegations arriving for the summit were indeed bringing copies of the original Meridian Accords, and that they expected King Edmund to honor the agreements his father had signed. The communication also revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. If the original agreements could not be kept secret, Lady Margaret and her allies were prepared to claim that King Edmund had been aware of them all along, but had been deliberately ignoring Valdoria's obligations. This would provide justification for the foreign powers to take more aggressive action to enforce the terms of the accords. "It's a perfect trap," King Edmund said grimly, as they reviewed the intercepted communication. "If I claim ignorance of the accords, they'll present evidence that my own advisors have been in regular contact with them about implementing the agreements. If I acknowledge the accords, I'll be forced to comply with terms that would essentially end Valdoria's independence." Isabella studied the documents spread across her father's private study, her mind working through the implications of everything they had learned. "But there's a third option," she said slowly. "What if we expose the conspiracy publicly before the summit begins? What if we reveal everything about how Lady Margaret and the others have been deceiving both you and the foreign powers?" King Edmund looked at his daughter with growing respect. "That's extremely dangerous. If we make accusations like that without absolute proof, it could destroy the government and leave Valdoria vulnerable to invasion or economic collapse. But if we don't act," Isabella replied, "then Lady Margaret and her allies win either way. They either succeed in keeping the accords secret forever, which means they continue to control the government from the shadows, or they force you to implement agreements that you never knew existed." Sir Richard nodded thoughtfully. "The princess is right, Your Majesty. We're facing a situation where inaction is more dangerous than action. But if we're going to move against the conspiracy, we need to do it in a way that protects the kingdom from retaliation." They spent the evening developing a plan that was audacious in its scope and timing. Rather than wait for the foreign delegations to present their demands at the summit, They would reveal the conspiracy publicly the night before the summit began, presenting all the evidence they had gathered and forcing the conspirators to respond to accusations of treason and deception. The plan required careful coordination and precise timing. Isabella would use her photography skills to document the final meeting of the conspirators, which intelligence suggested would take place that evening to coordinate their last-minute preparations. Meanwhile, Sir Richard would prepare to arrest the primary conspirators, and King Edmund would draft a public statement revealing the full extent of the deception that had been practiced against the crown and the people of Valdoria. As night fell and the moment of action approached, Isabella felt the weight of everything that had led to this point. In just 3 days, she had evolved from an innocent child with a camera into a key figure in a battle for the future of her kingdom. The skills and courage that had been developing throughout her young life were now being tested in ways she could never have anticipated. The final confrontation took place in the same conference room where Isabella had recorded the conspirators the previous night. This time, however, she was not alone in the shadows. Sir Richard's security team was positioned throughout the building, and King Edmund himself was monitoring the situation from his private study. When Lady Margaret, General Blackstone, Lord Chancellor Whitehall, and their foreign contact assembled for their final planning meeting, they found themselves surrounded by the evidence of their own treachery and the consequences of their betrayal. The arrests were swift and decisive, but the real victory came when King Edmund addressed the nation that evening, revealing the full truth about the Meridian Accords and the conspiracy that had hidden them for 20 years. He spoke honestly about his father's difficult decisions and the impossible situation that had led to agreements that compromised Valdoria's independence. But he also spoke about the courage of those who had exposed the truth and the determination of the kingdom to face its challenges openly and honestly. The foreign delegations that arrived for the summit the next day found themselves dealing with a completely changed situation. Instead of being able to enforce secret agreements against an unprepared monarch, they were forced to negotiate with a king who knew exactly what his father had signed and was prepared to discuss how those agreements could be modified to reflect the changed circumstances of the past 20 years. The negotiations that followed were difficult and sometimes contentious, but they resulted in new agreements that preserved Valdoria's independence while addressing the legitimate concerns of the neighboring kingdoms. The process was transparent and public, with full documentation available to the people of Valdoria and the international community. Isabella's role in exposing the conspiracy became public knowledge, and she found herself celebrated as a hero throughout the kingdom. But more importantly, she had learned valuable lessons about courage, truth, and the responsibility that comes with knowledge and power. Uncle Marcus returned from the northern provinces to find that his young niece had become one of the most famous people in Valdoria, but he also found that she remained the same thoughtful, curious girl who had always asked difficult questions and looked for answers that others missed. "I'm proud of you," he told Isabella during one of their walks through the palace gardens, now restored to their peaceful role as a place of reflection rather than conspiracy. "But I'm not surprised. You've always had the heart of a photographer, seeing what others miss and capturing the truth that lies beneath the surface." Isabella smiled as she adjusted the settings on her camera, preparing to photograph the late afternoon light as it filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak trees. "I think I understand now what you meant when you said that photography is about seeing what might be hidden beneath the surface. But I also learned that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that people are trying to keep hidden." As she raised her camera to capture the peaceful beauty of the gardens, Isabella reflected on everything that had changed in her life over the past week. She was still 12 years old, still the same person who loved photography and asked questions that sometimes made adults uncomfortable. But she was also someone who had faced real danger and had chosen to do what was right, even when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent. The kingdom of Valdoria had survived its crisis and had emerged stronger and more honest than before. The truth about the Meridian Accords was now part of the historical record, and future generations would be able to learn from both the mistakes and the courage of those who had shaped their nation's destiny. And at the center of it all was a young princess with a camera who had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against deception and corruption is simply the willingness to see clearly and to share what you have seen with others who have the courage to act on the truth. Isabella continued her photography, but now she approached it with a deeper understanding of the responsibility that comes with the power to reveal truth. She had learned that seeing clearly is only the first step. The real challenge lies in having the courage to act on what you see, even when doing so requires you to face dangers that seem far beyond your ability to handle. The secret photograph that had started everything now hung in a place of honor in the royal archives, a reminder of how a single moment of truth can change the course of history. But Isabella knew that it was not the photograph itself that had saved the kingdom. It was the decision to act on what the photograph revealed, and the willingness to risk everything for the sake of justice and truth. As the sun set over Ravencrest Palace, casting long shadows across the gardens where so much had begun, Isabella smiled and continued her photography, secure in the knowledge that she had helped to ensure that future generations of Eldorians would grow up in a kingdom built on truth rather than deception, courage rather than fear, and hope rather than the hidden conspiracies that had once threatened to destroy everything her family and her people held dear. The game was over, and truth had won.